Hi, ich wollte nur mal kurz sagen, dieser Podcast hat jetzt auch einen Newsletter, damit du keine Folge mal so aus Versehen verpasst und damit du mitbekommst, wenn es eine Aktion oder ein Special rund um Bin weg bouldern gibt. Den Newsletter, den findest du auf meiner Steady-Seite, das ist steadyhq.com/binwegbouldern und natürlich auch auf binwegbouldern.de. Das war's, viel Spaß mit dieser Folge.
You realize that the way you climb is like determined by decades and even centuries before you. Because people might think like, well, it's a little bit boring, all of those historical accounts, blah, blah, blah. But it's just giving more flavor to what we do.
Hi and welcome to episode 122 of Bin weg bouldern. My name is Juliane Fritz and my guest is Zofia Reych. And our topic is climbing history. Zofia lives in Fontainebleau and is known to my listeners as the founder of the Women's Bouldering Festival in Fontainebleau. And now Zofia has published a book about climbing, and I'm going to talk to them about it. The book is called Born to Climb, From Rock Climbing Pioneers to Olympic Athletes. It's not a typical history book, as you will learn in my talk with them. It connects the history of climbing with social questions, historical backgrounds, and also Zofia's own history plays a part in the book. And in the book, you learn how the sport became what it is today. Have fun with this talk, and maybe also with the book if you're going to read it. This podcast is supported by its listeners with a crowdfunding on the platform Steady. I thank you all for making my work possible. And if you want to join and support Bin weg bouldern, then check out steadyhq.com and search for Bin weg bouldern. The link is also on my website and in the Shownotes. Hi, Zofia, and congrats for your book.
Oh, hi. Thank you so much. It's really cool to speak to you again.
Yeah, it's really cool that we have like a new topic to speak about, your book.
Yeah.
And it's called Born to Climb, From Rock Climbing Pioneers to Olympic Athletes. And it's a book about climbing history. And of course, you are not the first person who wrote about climbing history. So first question is, why did you want to add another book and why this book?
Well, I actually don't think this is a historical book per se. Like, I don't view it as such, although it deals a lot with climbing's history. I wanted it to be more of a portrait of the discipline that would include what the sport or the discipline is today, how it got there, various sort of experiences that people have within this realm of climbing, and obviously history is like a really big part of how the sport developed. So yeah, a big percentage of the book deals with history, but for me more important was to like put everything in context. So I wanted to have like those climbing breakthrough moments and those sort of almost mythical or iconic climbing figures, but put within a broader socio-political context that would make them connected to the broader society and just make sense, because like climbers often have this perception, or whatever we do as humans, we have this perception that is like hugely original and sort of removed from other aspects of life. And I wanted to show how much climbing is actually a part of this broader context.
I think there are so many points where you put climbing in a kind of interesting context. And I want to talk about some of these things. So we can't talk about the whole book because, I mean, people have to read it. And one thing is that you try to talk about women in climbing history. And I think there are some interesting perspectives about that. And I guess it's kind of unique. It might not have been like the most obvious thing that people in books about climbing history talk about the women in climbing history. So would you say it was a bit hard to find out about the women in the history?
I mean, certainly when it comes to the history of rock climbing, so like the more modern aspect as opposed to mountaineering, which I also mention a tiny bit in the book, it's easier. And then when you look at the older times when like 19th century and maybe even further back, there are fewer sources that talk about women and their activity in the mountains and on the rocks. And I think the perception a lot of the time is that there were very few of them doing it. But there is like this new outlook that actually there were more than we realize. It's just that they didn't document their activity in the same way that their male counterparts did. So people are now finding more and more evidence in terms of primary sources, such as diary entries, letters that document women's presence and activity in climbing. But they didn't produce things such as books or lectures or articles, which were so common and so much a part of climbing for men. Just because, they didn't have enough time because they had to take care of the households and children. And also there wasn't this aspirational aspect to women's climbing, I suppose, because it was men who would like get an adventure done or an achievement, a new peak, whatever, and then feel the need to present that in the club, at a dining society, to build up their reputation in the society. And women didn't engage in that in this way because it wasn't seen like adventuring and being like an explorer, wasn't seen as something proper or something that would build up social sort of value of a woman. So yeah, like just basically much less evidence. And so often in sources that I was reading, women were like an afterthought. So like it would be said like, oh, this man was climbing this and this and this, and actually his sister was with him. But there wouldn't be any agency assigned to those women, or they wouldn't be the focus of the story. And I actually found it a little bit frustrating that I didn't have myself access to this primary research into the sort of sources that are now being dug up that prove that there were slightly more women in climbing than we actually think there were. And this is something that people are doing like at university level. Researchers, they are digging up those resources, and we're going to have more available to us. This wasn't the scope of my research to like find those new sources, but I definitely wanted to highlight the things that were mentioned in some existing accounts and just really focus on them.
I think all of us, we can name female climbers who are living today, but from the history of climbing, we would not know any names. Would you say that there are women that we should know, and maybe you can also say why we should know them, why they were important in history?
I mean, it really just depends how interested you are in those historical records, because, you know, if you go to the gym and ask people about climbers from the 19th century, people are just not going to remember and know any names, like I'd say the majority of climbers. But certainly among the sort of more geeky climbers, there is a bigger, higher awareness of those historical people who pushed the sport in the days gone by. And certainly women are way like less known, while there were like super impressive feats accomplished by women in that time. And I always bring up the persona of Lizzie LeBlond, who was active in the Alps in the 19th century. And I love the fact that she was active so early on, when it was still unacceptable for women to climb in trousers. And actually, I tell the story all the time. So I feel like anybody who has ever come to any of my lectures or like listened to a podcast with me already knows that story. But basically, Lizzie was climbing peak out of Zermatt. So she went from Zermatt to a peak called Zinalrothon. And as soon as she left the town, she removed her skirt, because that's what she was doing. Like, she was aware that, well, skirt isn't the best attire for climbing. So as soon as she was out of sight of people, she would take her skirt off and wear trousers. And then accidentally she left her skirt up top. And then when she returned to the town, she realized she doesn't have her skirt. So she went back up and got it before entering the town. So literally she went up the mountain twice. And this is a mountain that's like over 4,000 meters tall. And to this day is being climbed by tourists with a guide. And, you know, that just proves so much how accomplished and competent women were at this time. That's probably one of my favorites. But a lot of climbers were, like male climbers, were taking their wives with them to the mountains, and they were always being seen as this like addition as opposed to having their own agenda. And I think so much of it is down to how the stories are told, not to actual human desires. So I think the more we focus on those untold stories, the more we will realize that they were there.
So what kind of role did these women then play when they joined their husbands?
Well, I think they probably had the same motivations and the same enjoyment of the experience as their male partners. If anything, I'd say that very likely their male partners might have had some negative external motivation in which they wanted to, prove something to their peers or prove something to themselves in terms of even masculinity, show like that they're explorers, that they're doing something for the first time. There would be a lot of machismo, certainly, and certainly a lot of competition. But then at the same time, if women were going into the mountains, they were certainly doing it from like internal motivations, because there wasn't anything externally that would gratify them for it. So all the validation from it was just the fact that they loved it.
Because there was no competition for them, so no...
There was no competition, or there was also no even praise. If you were a male explorer or a male climber, and then you would go meet up at the Alpine Club dinner, then you'd present your adventures and everybody would applaud you. But women were not even allowed to be members of mountain clubs and climbing clubs. So they would go and do something and then just return to their work and return to homes and get on with life. So there wasn't any external gratification for them. It was purely the fact that they loved it.
So and you just mentioned one thing. There were these alpine clubs, and most of the time they were for men only. Can you talk more about like the boundaries, the struggles that women had when they were trying to go into the mountains, when they were trying to go climbing? So what were the limits they had?
I mean, speaking of climbing and mountain clubs, I think one of the first ones to accept women was the Austrian Alpine Club. But when it comes to the first mountain club, which is the Alpine Club in the UK, they actually didn't accept women for a very, very long time. I think well into the 60s of the 20th century.
Short break. Zofia wasn't sure here, but we looked it up later, and it was actually not in the 60s, but in the 70s. In 1974, women were finally allowed in the British Alpine Club. Okay, but then Zofia had a story that there had been a female member before 1974, but it was not a human. Let's go on with the story.
And the first female member of the Alpine Club was a dog. And I suppose it was a bit of a joke, and they were like, women and female climbers are not allowed to be members, but we're going to accept this dog in honor of the fact that I think the dog went up Mont Blanc or some other peak. Well, the dog went everywhere because its owner was a female climber that was extremely accomplished, and her name was Meta Brevoort. And she actually introduced her nephew to the mountains, who then became a prolific mountaineer and a celebrated mountaineer who wrote about his climbing. But it would be forever him more known in the, climbing circles than her, even though she was the sort of...
the inspiration for him.
She was the inspiration, she was the guide. And, well, they also used actually professional guides at the time. But in terms of amateur climbing, she was very much the guide for him. And she wouldn't be allowed to be a member of the club, which is absolutely shocking. Like, a dog would be allowed, but not her.
Yeah.
When it comes to barriers for women, I think they were very much like systemic. So it wouldn't be that, we don't want women to climb. It was more that women were just not allowed to be active, independent, and forthcoming in the public sphere at all. So how could they get to the mountains if they were supposed to be creatures of the household? If they were not allowed to be members of dining societies, of clubs, if they were just not seen as social creatures, they were seen as somebody who should be taking care of the household in the background, supporting the husband. So I think that's the biggest thing. We think of immediate sort of barriers, such as, women were not allowed to wear trousers. Yeah, of course, that is an inconvenience. But I think at the core of things was this perception that women are physically weak, mentally weak, and that their dominion is a household. So the same barriers that prevented them from climbing prevented them from entering any other public sphere.
And there are some examples in the book that also show what it was like for women in the past. And there's one example when you were writing about Lynn Hill.
Oh, yes.
An example for sexism in our sport, and that's not too long ago, at a climbing competition in the 80s where the male climbers could win a car, and she asked if a woman would also get a car if she won, and she was told yes, they would if they climbed topless. This is just an example that's, I think, very clearly to everyone that's a sexist thing to say and do. What would you say in our sport, even today, are there, because of its history maybe, are there still sexist structures that we see now?
I mean, it's not the history of climbing that's sexist, it's the history in general. I don't think we can necessarily talk about things that are particular to climbing without pointing out to the wider struggle for gender equality. And, you know, this is an example that people see as a bit extreme, but to me, the most obvious sort of example of discrimination in sports, in everyday life, is the fact that people with breasts, people who present traditionally heteronormatively feminine, are not allowed to go topless, in connection with that comment about the competition, whereby women would be allowed to win a car if they went topless, but that would be seen as something done for the male gaze, for male pleasure, while it's not completely considered that maybe women and people with breasts just want to go topless because it's not always comfortable to wear a bra, because it might be hot, because basically everybody should have the same rights. This is like the most stark example, and people often tell me, well, this is very extreme, and people have various opinions on female and physiology in general. Even in terms of what competitors wear, like, you can very often see that in any sport, the male outfits are sort of loose and slightly more covering, while female outfits are revealing and tight. And it's this crazy balance that women have been always subjected to, of like, on one hand, you need to censor yourself to sort of not step into your physical or sexual power, but at the same time, you need to reveal yourself enough to tantalize the male gaze. And it's just ridiculous. Mm-hmm. And so these are the sort of like very superficial examples. But then we can take a step back and look at the more ingrained things, like even the way competitions are structured, whether it is climbing. I think climbing competition-wise actually is very forward when it comes to diminishing the gender gap. But in general, any sports, any modern sports, it was created in a way that highlights qualities that are usually associated with masculinity. How we grade things, you know, we give harder grades for bigger moves. While if we had more problems outdoors opened by small climbers who tend to be female with tiny crimps, and, you know, those problems wouldn't even need to be tall. And then you could create, you know, a 9A boulder that would be insanely hard for a tall climber. But then they would say like, oh, well, just reach past the small holds. But these rules are all arbitrary. It's arbitrary that we have to sit down to start a boulder problem. It's arbitrary that in a competition you have to touch both hands to the top hold. So why couldn't we say, well, if you want to get that grade, you need to grab all of those tiny holds? And it seems ridiculous. Like, why would anybody do such a boring thing? But this is only seen as boring because we're conditioned to see it as boring.
Yeah. Would you say that it's would be also an interesting thing to that climbing competitions, there was a category for men and women together?
Well, these days, more and more often, I know that route setters set competitions that don't differentiate between genders. And I think it's really nice. And I think if you're a good route setter, you can really create boulder problems that don't cater to one body type more or to another, or at least if you have a bunch of boulder problems, you can then create them in a way that they will be very egalitarian. And I think that's great, not only for diminishing the gap between men and women, but also because it allows us to lessen the focus on the gender binary, because there are athletes as well who don't fit into that gender binary. And then which competition should they take part in? You know, if somebody's a non-binary person or somebody's a trans person, there is always this question like, oh, they can't compete in this because that would give them an advantage, or people always find ways to put those people down. And when you have a competition that's non-gendered, suddenly it's not a problem. And it turns out that the podium is usually a mixture of genders and not preferential for one or another or any other.
And there's also examples like in the history of climbing that there were, I think it's also one example in the book. There was a route that was climbed first by a man, and then a woman did the climb. And then it was like, okay, we have to downgrade that. Okay, it can't be that hard if she did that. So this also shows that what is climbing, what is hard in climbing. What you were just saying, is it just like being able to reach far, or is it also like being able to like hold very small crims, or like climb something also as a small person? So
I mean, even that perception that women always like crims, that's also sexist to start with, because as soon as women started doing serious strength training, it turned out that loads of women are good at compression boulders. And so it's all like much more diverse than we are used to thinking. And it's very good that things are starting to open up a little.
And would you add any more interesting findings about women in climbing history at this point here?
Well, I think it's just crazy in terms of historical accounts, how many there are of men doing things, and how often it is that a male athlete feels justified in creating an autobiography, or in just engaging in cultural production and providing content about what they do. To this day, it's very normal and very acceptable for men to broadcast their achievements, or even not achievements, but their journey, even their training, their interest in development. While for women, it is still very often seen as something indulgent. Oh, why is she so self-preoccupied? Why would I care to see her climbing? And then beyond that, I think every time we look at underrepresentation of women in climbing, we must add that there are more genders there too. There are people who don't fit the gender binary. And even historically, there were trans people in climbing history. There were queer people in climbing history, but they were just not out. But they were there. It's not that there were no non-binary people climbing. It's just they couldn't be openly non-binary. And I find it really cool because, I'm non-binary. So, hey, happy to say that and happy to be able to like represent that in climbing these days. And it's so good that people are starting to respect other ways to be.
Yeah. And also what you were just saying, that there are like more in the past, there had been more men writing about or talking about their achievements. I just found when I read the book that I need to read the biography of Lynn Hill, because it was really interesting.
Oh, it's fantastic. Lynn Hill's book is absolutely fantastic. And then there are 3 books by Steph Davis, which are really good. And in recent years, just like recent, I mean, last 2-3 years, there have been so many new examples of literature created by women in adventure, in the mountains and climbing. But they were always there, like maybe fewer, maybe less popular than these days, but they kind of always flew under the radar, and it's very cool to dig them out. Like I got myself a copy of Dorothy Piley's book. I think it's called, I don't remember the name at the moment, but this is like written in the 30s. And women were there and they were doing things. It just was never celebrated in the same way. And I think it's time we change that. And I think it's time we also use that for, in general, greater diversity in climbing and in general.
Oh, and if you have a best of list of books that you had been reading, you can just give some recommendations. I put them in the show notes.
Oh, yeah, sure. Okay, I'll have to think about which ones were my favorite, because it's really hard to choose.
Okay. And let's go on to another topic in the book. One thing that I found very interesting is that you tell your own history of climbing in the book. And you do that parallel to telling the history of climbing in general. And you also had some interesting adventures. You have been to interesting places. You met some interesting people, and you talk about that. But I must say the story that stuck in my mind the most is the story about you and your mother. Your mother raised you as a single parent, and she loved to go hiking in the mountains on her own. And in the book, you tell stories about her trips when she took you with her while you were still a toddler. And I think everyone who has children has an idea how hard or what kind of an adventure that must be. And also, you are from Poland, and you start the book with stories about the Polish Tatra and Polish climbers. And I think these are very special perspectives in a book, that we have a single mom in Poland in the 80s that loves the mountains, raises her child alone, and goes hiking with her child on her own. And I guess you won't find that in another book. Maybe other people would start the book with a famous climber in a well-known climbing area. And in the beginning, you take us to the mountains with your mom. And I think that's special. And I just wanted to ask, what was your idea behind telling your own story in the book?
There were two principal reasons for that. First one was that I didn't want the book to be seen as an attempt at presenting some sort of an objective truth. So by showing the reader my own background and my own path to climbing, I wanted to give them an idea of what would my perspective be, so that they would know that what I choose to focus on, what I highlight, my opinions, they are not, again, like hanging in void. They are all a result of my own experience and who I am. And it's impossible in general always to remove the researcher or to remove the writer from a perspective that's being presented. And I wanted to be really honest about that. And secondly, it was incredibly important within climbing's history to focus on those experiences that are not often highlighted, to show that there is so much in terms of how your climbing life could be like, how it could be different depending on what sort of political system you're raised within, time, politics, gender. There are so many things that can change that experience. And very often, in the way climbing history or any history is told in the West, it's with complete disregard to what was going on in the East, while the eastern side of the Iron Curtain was so influential in terms of how climbing developed. And it's so influential to present day because, we've got speed climbing in the Olympics, which is such an Eastern European thing. And just like focusing on those narratives that are usually not highlighted and focusing on narratives of the everyday climber, of the punter, of the non-professional, non-hero. I think that's more true to how the experience is for most people. Like, not everybody is Lynn Hill or Paul Preuss, but everybody has got their own sort of, you might be tempted to say, little story within climbing. But the fact that, there are no big peaks in there or big climbs doesn't mean the story is little or insignificant. And I thought that my mom's story was quite awesome. In all honesty, I haven't ever even put it into perspective the way you did, like the way you spoke about all of those unlikely things about my mom. I'm just like, oh my God, you're right. Like a single mother in the 80s with a toddler, hiking alone. Wow, that's mind-blowing. For me, it was important because it was personal, and it was important because it was showing this sort of like everyday or real or average side of climbing. But I didn't think that actually it was quite special in this sense that it seems unusual.
Yeah, you grew up like that, so...
Yeah, well, like, was it unusual? My mom didn't think it was unusual. Loads of people who do things don't think they are unusual. They are just then constructed as unusual within the sort of mainstream narrative.
Yes, of course. And, when I was reading the book, I think it's cool for the reader to have this... oh, let's see if in the next chapter there's going to be a story about Zofia again, or like I'm going to be presented another part of the history of climbing. So it was always interesting. So what comes up next, And I really liked switching from your story to climbing history back and forth. It was interesting, I think. It's a cool thing.
Yeah, and it's also not only that in my story I wanted to talk about my story, but very often, well, yes, obviously it's inevitable, but my story was sort of a starting point for talking about contemporary climbing. So the way actually I saw the structure was oscillating between the past and the present, and the present was just presented from my perspective, or starting from me as this sort of catalyst to tell us the story or a story. But yeah, for me, the way I saw the structure was more interchanging between like plunging ourselves into history and looking at climbing as it is today, rather than looking at official, in inverted commas, history and my personal history. That was less of my idea, but that's how it obviously looks like.
Yeah, but also the way you do that, you invite more like the new people in climbing to join you to get to know the climbing history. Mm-hmm. You take them with you in that way. That's also a good thing, I think. Next point, what I think is cool that you're doing it in the book is, I call this meeting cultures. I don't know if that's a good headline, but you talk, for example, about the history of climbing in Yosemite National Park, and you make a big room for the story of the indigenous people in the Yosemite Valley. So in the place where some of our biggest climbing heroes have their adventures, there, indigenous people were displaced and lost their home. So that's, I guess, something that we don't think about when we watch the movies about Alex Honnold and everything. What are some of the facts that you found or find important for the climbing community to know about?
I mean, for me, the most mind-blowing aspect of it all is that there are so many accounts about climbing in Yosemite. It's in fact one of the most celebrated chapters in climbing's history, and yet there is no context of, as you said, basically the erasure and displacement of indigenous people that was happening within a mile from the epicenter of the climbing world in Yosemite, which was Camp 4. And it really struck me as, well, extraordinary in the worst sense of the word, that I myself have gone through countless, well, probably it's possible to count them, but for quite a few climbing books and articles and movies throughout my life, even before thinking about writing this book, that would tell me so much about every minor detail of the competition between climbers in Yosemite and the development of climbing techniques and what were they getting up and what were they not getting up on. And nobody has ever mentioned the fact that a mile from Camp 4, there was the village of Miwok and Yokut people who lived in the Awanichi Valley for centuries before white colonizers arrived there, and that they were just kicked out violently. They were kicked out by a militia, armed militia that chased them into the valley. That's how Yosemite Valley was discovered for white people, while they were chasing native people, indigenous people, and trying to catch them all and put them in reservations. The chief's son was shot in the back during that raid. We are talking here, I think, the 50s of the 19th century. I don't quite remember if it was 51 or 52, but yeah, mid-19th century. And that was pretty much 3 or 4 years before the first inn was opened for the leisure and entertainment of white people in Yosemite. And the displacement of people who lived in the valley before that has been going on until this day. And this is a story that I looked at in the book. This is the story that I researched to present it as well as I could in the book. But it's a story that's not unusual. It's the story of every single national park, of every single public land in the US, and, in fact, all land in the US. But the shocking part is that we don't talk about it. We just sort of sweep it under the rug and behave as if it didn't happen. And this is an extreme example of how privilege operates. It basically means if something is not your problem, it is not a problem, and it gets omitted. For me, it's not okay that there were climbers who wrote all those books about what was going on in their climbing, and they didn't mention, oh my God, actually, these people are being treated in the most cruel, most inhumane way. How was it possible that those climbers did not... I don't want to apportion blame or anything, because, those climbers were a product of their environment. And to a large degree, I'm sure we are erasing peoples these days, and we will only realize with time, whether it be, for ethnic reasons or for other reasons like gender or economical status. But yeah, looking back at the time, it's just mind-blowing that it happened that way.
Yeah. And I must say that is also a thing you said, in the US, you could think more about that, about the indigenous people there. But I think somehow it stands for climbing in many places in the world, because rock climbers are often see themselves as travelers who explore the world, to get to know places that are far away, who get to know people from other cultures, and they could be people who make connections and find out about the stories and tell those stories. But Like you already said that when we look at our climbing movies, what kind of stories are told there? The climber, the mountain, the hard route, the struggle in the mind of the climber and everything. And not so often we get the stories about, okay, where are they climbing?
Yeah.
Who's like living there and what's happening there? You made the example of the US, but I think we could talk about that in other places too.
Oh, yeah, totally. And even, in present day, when we go climbing into like those newly found bouldering areas in Switzerland, there are very rarely questions asked about how it affects the local community, whether they want us there at all. There is actually an ongoing struggle in Alce Ferreira between climbers and the local community. And obviously from the perspective of climbers, it looks like we should definitely be welcome there. But from the perspective of the local community, it's kind of different. And even for myself, it's quite hard to be able to find an objective perspective or a fair perspective, because I am a climber and it's very difficult to remove yourself from that situation and have an objective outlook, which I think kind of explains how those horrible things might have come to pass in the past. But yeah, I think it's a problem in general with tourism, with going places and treating them in a consumerist way and seeing them as something for entertainment and not realizing that this is the home of somebody else. I think it's apparent in every form of travel that we do for entertainment, like, going to warm destinations, winter sunshine breaks, stuff like that. It's always very, very rooted in colonialism, in white privilege, in economic privilege. I always use the word economic and economical more, but financial privilege, we also don't talk about that. Like even going to countries that are just not financially well off, people sort of invade them. And I'm definitely guilty of the same. And we always see where we are being treated unfairly, but we don't see when we treat others unfairly. And I think just being critical and continually sort of examining our own actions, motives, and how we treat others is super important, because otherwise those really harsh realities happen, and then we ask ourselves like, oh, how was it possible? Well, that's how, because we didn't question. We don't do it today either.
Yeah, so for me, I was just really thinking about that a lot, and I think it just says that we have some work to do and some stories to tell and some questions to ask.
Yeah,
it's the job of me and a job that you also have as like someone who writes books.
Yeah, like I think being a storyteller must be, obviously everybody can tell the stories that they want to tell, but if you want to be a conscious storyteller, it's an important role in that we can reflect on things and try to present them in a new context. Yeah.
Next point, a big one in the book, is changes in the history of climbing. A lot of these changes you can summarize as traditionalists versus innovators in the climbing history. The sport has gone through so many changes, and every change caused a debate, caused arguments between the old ones and the young ones. Mm-hmm. Looking at this, it says a lot about, I think, society again in general. And also, I think, a lot about climbing and why it is like it is even today. I think one of the most well-known changes is the Rotpunkt movement. I guess a lot of people know what that is. It was started by Kurt Albert. It used to be normal in climbing to use technical aid to get up a wall or a mountain. And then younger climbers started at the challenge to go up without technical aid and just use the equipment to keep themselves safe when they fall. And this is the kind of climbing we still know today. Anyone who does not know what Rotpunkt means, Kurt Albert, a climber from Nuremberg, used to paint a red dot at the start of every route that he managed to climb free without aid. And somehow this approach was an affront to the older climbers who did not do it like that. And they were like, okay, this is not the heart of climbing anymore. When you read the history of climbing or the research you did, were there any other turning points that you found also special and that you would mention here?
Well, I think it's very important to clarify here that this again is a perception that is sort of created by the narratives we repeat and the stories that we tell, because climbing with age is still very much a thing that people do. So people still use like sky hooks and what's all sort of like daisy chains and things that to me are very exotic to get up walls. And it's a whole different and separate microcosm within climbing, because so often just, one type of climbing gets popular. Like, for example, now in cities, we've got indoor bouldering super popular, or outdoors, probably the most popular is at the moment still sport climbing in the sort of Rotpunkt fashion started by Kurt Albert. But it's not that this is the only thing people do. People still do trad climbing. People still do aid climbing. People do dry tooling, which is, using, how do you call them?
Ice axed.
Ice axes, yes. People use sort of axes to climb on rock, and then people do mixed climbing when they climb rock and ice. And oh my God, there are so many ways to climb. And again, like those turning points that we see as turning points are just how they were then retold in stories, Before Kurt Albert, there was Paul Preuss, who was saying that we shouldn't use gear at all, because if we use gear, then it means that we don't trust our own climbing, and climbing should be about proficiency in the knowing that you're not going to fall. So he saw the use of equipment as something that would actually make you a more unreliable climber, because you would be able to fall and then potentially your gear would fail you and you would hurt yourself. So he was a proponent of essentially soloing as the most safe and sensible way to climb. And, there are loads of people who solo. So that's the thing. I don't like choosing those certain moments as the most important in when something changed in climbing. Because if you actually look closely, people still will cling on to what is seen as the old ways. People do it and it's equally important to them,
What they did in this Rotpunkt movement, it had been done before. So it's not like they were the first people to do that. So,
But if I were to choose something that I found really sort of influential for rock climbing as a whole, it would be probably people realizing that they can have adventures without going very far from home. So when people, working class people couldn't afford to travel afar, and they were like, well, we can climb on rocks that are just close by to our cities and workplaces. And that's how rock climbing on outcrops really took off. And I think that's really interesting, because that is basically like this egalitarian side of the story that really meant that climbing took the direction that it took. It's kind of cool and beautiful that it was more open to all, but it was being opened by more people to themselves. Do you know what I mean? They were like taking possession of it and being like, oh, okay, so like you're going to the Alps or you're going to Dolomites and having a great time. Well, I'm going to go and climb on gritstone. It's a miniaturization of climbing in a sense. But it really shows that humans don't need such grandiose settings to have a great time and a great experience.
Yeah, and also it pushed the sport further because more people had the possibility to go climbing.
Of course.
Now we see that the sport is growing because of the gyms that we have now in almost every city, like here in Germany and also in France. So this is the development, like a step further.
Yeah. And it's kind of inevitable that for people who, for example, were mountain climbers, then rock climbing is going to be like, oh, they're climbing on this like silly small rock that's not really serious. And then for people who are rock climbers, if somebody's like an indoor climber, they're going to be like, oh, it's like, it seems less and less real, or maybe, as I said, miniaturized more and more to those people who were doing it before on a sort of larger scale. But then with every step, it turns out that the adventure is the same, the emotions are the same. And that's why we can't really be like condescending to any new iteration of climbing, because people are finding the same emotion in it.
Yeah.
I think this is a more important aspect of climbing than making it a spectator sport, Olympics and such, Like, it's more important that people get to do it, and it's more important that people, for example, do it at an indoor wall than people watch movies about insane ascents in Patagonia. Or it's great that people do those ascents. It's great that they have those experiences, but an actual experience of going to the climbing wall or to your local crag, however esoteric, which is a nice word for shitty it might be, this experience is going to be more profound than watching something on a screen?
I think I like both. I think I also like a good climbing movie.
Oh yeah, like storytelling and consuming stories is a great human thing. Like stories are incredibly important to us, and very often when we go to a climbing wall or when we go like rock climbing, we might be inspired by those stories that we've seen. So yes, for sure, it's not, I don't want to see that one is more important than the other, but I think they must go hand in hand.
Another thing that I'm thinking about quite often is these changes in the climbing scene. To me, it feels like climbers are trying to hold on to something that is impossible to hold, which is a funny thing to say. But you can't prevent change while you are acting in your sport. So it's like the people think you can stop everything, like you can freeze like what you have right now. So for example, I often hear older climbers that they think that the spirit of climbing is lost in the new generation that grows up in the gyms. But when you look at it, who built these gyms? It was the older generation because they wanted places to train. They wanted to find ways to make a living with their passion. So they started building gyms. And so they caused the change on their own. And then another interview I just heard, there was an outdoor boulderer who was asked, what is this old climbing spirit about that you're talking about? What does that mean? And the person said, the spirit to him was very much about everyone knowing everyone in the scene because the scene was so small. And what is gone now is the familiarity of the scene.
Well, climbing wall is the same. Like climbing wall can be a small scene, right? We can look at it on a local level and we'll have the same spirit.
Yeah, but you know, everyone like who's passionate for the sport talks about it, writes about it, shows to his friends, oh, climbing is a cool thing, you can try that. Everyone grows the sport. So you can't prevent change like that. It would mean like to freeze everything and stop telling people about it.
I like looking at this in terms of this phenomenon that I heard a cool name for, which is narcissism of small difference. This is how people can create cultures and subcultures by being super adamant about the fact that the way they do things is the right way. Because if we were not like that, then we would not create those ways of doing things in the first place. So you wouldn't be able to have trad climbing if trad climbers were not like, this is the one way you do trad climbing, and if you change it, it's wrong. Do you know what I mean? We arrive at a point when something is sort of like mature, and then that maturity is completely arbitrary, but basically at some point of the development of anything that we do, it starts being the sort of classic form of how it's done, and then people who do it start protecting it. And that is this narcissism of small difference, whereby we say, like, you know, even today in a competition, you have to put two hands on top of the boulder, like on the last hold. If you don't do that, it's not valid. And we have to stand by it, because if we don't stand by it, then we will not be able to create this thing that we call competition climbing the way it is today. And that constant dance between the protection of what exists and innovation is really interesting, and I think there is no point in seeing it as negative. It's just how it is. But if you think about it, there is this very important part about protecting what we have created, because otherwise there would be, like, everybody would do everything in an individual way, and there wouldn't be a social aspect to it. The social aspect requires fighting for the old ways, which inevitably will perish. Inevitably, they will transform and become something new.
Yeah, there's so much transformation in the sport. There was also a listener who, I told some of my listeners about this interview, and he was asking a question, or it's more a bunch of thoughts. Some of the things that we were just talking about, that it's the dilemma of the sport. Climbing began outdoors, but the way we see it now, or people get to see it now at the Olympics, it has not so much to do with outdoor climbing anymore. And he thinks that for him, the Rotpunkt rules were good and clear. And now at the Olympics, we have a competition sport with rules that are really hard to understand. And at the same time, the sport grew so much that outdoor climbing is endangered now, because we damage the nature with what we're doing when like masses are going out to the rocks. So the origin of the sport is limited more and more by what we're doing. And he was asking if, like, after you've read so much about climbing and like wrote down your thoughts, do you have a vision of where is climbing going?
I mean, it's a really hard question to answer without starting to go a little bit more philosophically into who we are and what we are doing as humans. Because, like, to be honest, I don't really see much hope for humanity to be a sustainable presence on Earth, and that includes climbing and everything else. The way we're going, we are going to run out of resources, and those resources include everything that we eat, but they also include the rock that we climb on, and obviously one is less essential than the other. But I think, unfortunately, that's our fate, and we are sort of morally, the way I see it, that's sort of my philosophy that I've been developing for my own use recently, just to not get too depressed by the way things are heading. I feel it's my moral obligation to try and limit negative impact that I have, to try and preserve nature, and not doing that I see as wrong. But at the same time, I think that there is nothing we can do to really stop it, and the only way it's going to get better is when the planet ejects us from its surface, at the same way it did with dinosaurs, you know. So climbing outdoors is becoming less and less sustainable. Crags are being overcrowded, there is littering, rock is being damaged, there is erosion. Like, I myself take part in the fight against erosion in Fontainebleau Forest. We run workshops whereby we create like structures that hold sand and soil together to stabilize boulders and trees, and we have to do that. This is the right way to go about life, at least for me, because this is our, like, you know, the planet is our home, the crags are a part of our home, and we have to take care of them. Well, you know, it all sounds very grim.
Yeah, it does. But it's good that you are still one of the people who goes out and acts. Because I know that some people would say, okay, I'm done talking about this. I'm done
yeah,
trying.
But I go out and act, and I go out and I try to educate people about how to be outdoors, and I try and educate myself how to be the least sort of negative impact on the outdoors that I can be. But at the same time, I cannot deny the fact that I am a negative presence in the outdoors. Mm-hmm. Me being on the rocks means that there is no vegetation growing on it. Like, you know, in Fontainebleau, every single climbing rock is this grey and bare lump of sandstone. This is not how Fontainebleau rock looks like. Fontainebleau rock should be covered in moss and lichen, and should be a habitat for countless and countless of species. Just by removing that moss from the rocks that we climb, we have impacted the forest so much. Not to speak about the fact that the forest isn't a proper forest anymore, but a managed woodland for the last couple of 100 years that doesn't have proper biodiversity. That's a completely different thing. But every time I go outside, every time my feet touch the soil, I kill vegetation, I scare animals off. Like, if we would want to completely stop it, we would just need to stop existing. And we can't do that because the point of existing is existing. So we keep on doing it. But yeah, I think unfortunately there is no solution there.
Really, one good thing is that I guess some people know that you are organizing the Women's Bouldering Festival in Fontainebleau, where you also try to give this information further to people, also people who are new to the sport. So
it's incredibly important to educate like people who go into climbing walls and then take their climbing from indoor to outdoor, to talk to them about how outdoors is not the same as a gym whereby you're a consumer, right? Like, for example, people come to the crag and they're like, well, there is no bin, so I'm just going to throw my litter on the ground. Well, there is no bin because this is not a paid service. You are a part of the outdoors. And I think it's incredibly important that we teach people that.
Yeah. And another thing that also connects with what we just were talking about, that you are a person who tries to talk to the new generation of boulderers from the gyms that want to come outside. I think the cover and the subtitle of the book, they also stand a little bit for this. Mm-hmm. The book is called Born to Climb: From Rock Climbing Pioneers to Olympic Athletes. And on the cover, there's not a man like Wolfgang Güllich on real rock, but there's a female competition climber bouldering on an artificial wall. And it's a picture of Natalia Grossman that we see there.
I think actually it's from a lead climbing competition. You just can't see the rope. But I'm almost sure it was from a lead climbing comp.
I was looking at...
But it's a great picture, and it's taken from... it was taken by Lena Drapela at an indoor competition.
Yeah. So to me, it's interesting. It feels like, so with the cover, you speak to the new people who come into climbing, and they like take the book and then you take them to get to know the history where climbing is coming from. Like you want to connect the new ones and the old ones. Mm-hmm. So that is my feeling. Is that also something that you would say, okay, that was really an intention with the cover?
Yeah, and like then at the back of the cover, you've got the old picture of Meta Brevard and Coolidge and the Aldrich guides. So I really wanted to show like those two sides and to connect them and to show that they are inseparable and to insert those historical moments, like to show that they are all sort of like present in what we do today. And it gives like so much more meaning to what we do today and so much more fun as well. You realize that the way you climb is like determined by decades and even centuries before you. And it's super cool. And I think people, if they don't look at it, because people might think like, well, it's a little bit boring, all of those historical accounts, blah, blah, blah. But it's just giving more flavor to what we do, realizing where it came from. Because otherwise, like, you know, grabbing plastic lumps of colorful whatever stuck onto a wall is a very silly pastime. And it just becomes so much more meaningful when you realize that it's just a sort of new expression of a very old human activity.
Mm. Also in the title is the word Olympics. Mm-hmm. And I think the Olympics are kind of a high point of the evolution of the sport, if you can call it like that. Now, climbing had been part of the Olympics for the first time. It's also a part in your book where you analyze the history of the Olympics and you show also how much the Olympics need a sport like climbing, a young, popular sport, a sport that has this wild, adventurous, outdoorsy feeling and this kind of old spirit. And then the climbing industry, for all the years when we knew climbing at the Olympics, it's coming, the climbing industry was like, we need the Olympics to grow. So like both sides they needed each other. And now the premiere of climbing at the Olympics is over. And what would you say, what is your impression? What did climbing do for the Olympics? And on the other side, what did the Olympics do for climbing?
I mean, what climbing started doing for the Olympics is going to be very apparent as soon as the IOC has some reports on that. And I'm pretty sure they've already released reports on the viewership for 2020 Olympics and stuff like that. So we can learn, because for them, everything is about the bottom line and everything is about how many viewers sit in front of their screens and how much revenue they can create from advertising. And this is why the IOC needs attractive, interesting, dynamic sports like climbing. Because the most interesting and shocking to me is that the majority of people who are Olympic enthusiasts, and, you know, don't get me wrong, I love watching the Olympics. Like, I watch gymnastics, I watch ice skating in winter, I watch skiing. There are and I watch climbing in the Olympics. I love being a spectator in that sense. But me being a spectator is just basically creating revenue for broadcasters, and this is the main thing behind the Olympics. It's a huge entertainment business, and for the business to thrive, it needs to keep giving people what they want. And it turns out that the sort of old formats, old sports started being boring and fewer people were watching, and the audience of the Olympics were getting older and older, meaning that there was no prospect for sustainability within continually making money from it. So yeah, that's why climbing became part of the Olympics. I mean, we might want to gloss it over with all sorts of ideals about sports and, you know, amicable competition and whatnot. But unfortunately, or maybe not unfortunately, but in reality, spectator sports are a money-making machine. What the Olympics is doing for climbing, that's something that I have been thinking about for a while. And even somebody asked me a couple of days ago if I don't think that it's making climbing more diverse because it opens it to more people. And in a sense, yes. In a sense, maybe it will attract more diverse people to try climbing. But at the same time, we have to take into account the lack of diversity within mainstream sports that climbing is now becoming a part of. And situations that go on, like, as we talked before about clothing of athletes, for example. So we're looking here at gender divide, beach ball, athletes were fined for not wanting to compete in tiny clothing, because female beach ball athletes are obliged to compete in tiny pants so that they look sexy. And when they said we don't want to do it and they competed in something else, they were given penalty points. And then people ask me, don't you think that climbing is going to become more egalitarian or more diverse when it becomes a mainstream sport? And I'm like, well, I don't know, because I think the mainstream is bloody not diverse. So I don't know if good things are coming out of this. Certainly good things for the top athletes that get sponsorships, and that's good for them, because they can push their level and they can have a career within the sport. Certainly good things for coaches, good things for physiotherapists, more things happening for the human race, as always. But if for climbing and its potential at making people happy, is it big numbers of people? I don't know if this is the right way to go about things, but we can't stop it. Things are going to, as you said, progress, and there is no way in resisting it.
But what I'm realizing now is that it's what you said, it means more money for the climbers, the coaches and everything. I realize now that it's not that sustainable. It is given to a few people who are going to the Olympics. And now that the Olympics are over, these sources of money, they are over now.
Oh, of course. And I read an academic article in which they did a survey of professional athletes in the US. I think it was a survey of people who are in national teams. And between 50 and 60% of them were living close to the line of poverty, which is insane. We think of athletes as making those huge sponsorship deals and living a life of luxury. But these are gold medalists in the most popular disciplines. But the majority of athletes are actually super poor because there is nothing trickles down, and it's messed up because that basically shows how athletes themselves are being exploited for the entertainment of the masses. So they are being lured into thinking that they can make a career for themselves because the top athletes are given recognition and money and opportunities. So there is an influx of people going into the sport thinking, oh, this could be my career, so I'm going to give everything into this. But the reality is that they are then given scraps. Of course, a lot of people might say, well, they're doing this for the passion of the sport, of course. But, well, for the passion of the sport, do they need to train 12 hours a day to, it all just becomes extreme.
Yeah. You already said that you were watching the Olympics also before climbing was part of it. I'm not the same. I can't remember when I was watching the Olympics the last time. It was for a long time, the first time again, and now with climbing in it. And I like watching World Cups, World Championships in climbing more than the Olympics. I guess I don't know if it was because of the format this year that I did not enjoy it that much, and maybe it changes in Paris. But did you really enjoy the format and what you saw there? And are you looking forward to what's happening in Paris? Or what was your feeling in how it was shown and presented?
I mean, we all know that the format was contrived because the IOC just offered one medal, and then the IFSC had this tough choice of, well, what are we going to put forward for the Olympics? So they decided to do everything. So that made life difficult for athletes, and it made life difficult for climbing audiences to look at this new format because it kind of didn't make that much sense. It's interesting in the way that it makes athletes incredibly versatile. So I quite like that aspect. It's kind of like heptathlon or something like that, they have to do everything. But I think it is a little bit in contradiction to how climbing has been developing on its own, in the sense that usually if people were a speed climber, they were focusing on speed climbing. And, however much people might want to laugh at speed climbing, which is less and less the case, but it used to be this button of jokes a lot. But in certain countries, it's been a huge, huge sport for a very long time, and people trained for it very, very diligently. And actually super sort of high-level training protocols were invented or included in training for speed climbing way earlier than they were included in training for bouldering. But putting them together, it was kind of not really representative of how climbing has been developing in the past. So I know what is happening for Paris. They're putting bouldering and lead together and then speed separately. And I actually have this prediction, which I'm very curious to learn whether it's going to be correct or not with time. I have this prediction that speed climbing with time is going to do better as a mainstream spectator sport than bouldering or lead, because speed climbing is just so much easier to understand for the audience.
Yeah. I'm also very surprised that people I know who watched climbing for the first time at the Olympics, they often tell me that they found it interesting to see the speed climbing. You and me, I guess we would not expect that.
No, because like when you can imagine how difficult it is to hold on to a certain hold, or how difficult it is to hold a certain position on the wall, then you watch a competitor doing bouldering and lead, and you can really appreciate their mastery and the challenge that they are facing. But if you can't imagine how hard it is to hold on to that position or that hold, you're just like, why are they going so slowly? Why can't they just like, go up? Like, it's like when I took my mom rock climbing in Fontainebleau for the first time a couple of months ago, and she did her first boulder problem and said like, my God, I had no idea it was this physical. And I'm like, well, what did you think? It was easy? But like, if you don't have that experience, then you don't realize the level. While when somebody goes up a, very big wall in 5 seconds, it's clearly wow.
Yeah, I guess that's also because the reason for route setting to change so much to be like a more spectacular. Because it's hard to, like when we watch older climbing competitions, even for me, it's sometimes hard to understand. So what's interesting about this to watch?
Yeah, like super slow movement.
Slow moves, like on small crimps. Of course, the sport as it is now and as the route setting is now is much more interesting for an audience that is not climbing.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, but I also find that movement absolutely fascinating, what competitors are able to do, like all the triple dynos and stuff, and how they use momentum and all of this. It's fantastic. I really love that. Like, this is something very odd. I would personally love to see some sort of a climbing discipline in which we would combine like this physical prowess with an artistic expression. And this is funny because this is something that John Gill was almost advocating for. Like, he was saying that, climbing is like a routine, like a gymnastic routine. And I would kind of like even maybe more self-expression.
So like gymnastics with music and everything?
I don't know what it could be. Maybe again, it wouldn't be a spectator sport, but it would be something that we would like move on the walls to express ourselves. I don't know.
But I think what's interesting? I have made an interview with a climber and gym owner here in Germany who opened one of the first bouldering gyms. And he was also one of the first route setters for climbing competitions in Germany. And in the beginning, you had in the breaks between the rounds of the competition, you had a kind of climbing show.
Oh, wow.
Like an actor or an actress would show moves, and it was like part of a storyline.
Okay.
He told me about that and he was like, oh, why don't we have that anymore? That was funny.
So, I mean, there is so much we could do. And as we said before, climbing rules or whatever sports rules are completely arbitrary. And one thing is that whatever people do in the sort of mainstream thing is one thing, but then it should be totally acceptable to do things your way and to go on a rock and be like, oh, now I'm dancing on the rock, or even on a climbing wall. And yeah, I think this sort of diversity and appreciation for personal expression in any aspect of life should be greater.
No. Last part I want to talk about is bouldering. There's also a part about bouldering history in your book. And of course...
Oh, sorry. Can I just add one thing about the Olympics?
Yeah.
I think it is possible and hopefully it will happen that climbing being a mainstream sport is going to make it more racially diverse. We've seen that in gymnastics, with Simone Biles being now the best gymnast in the world, because being more mainstream, it is open to a broader pool of people coming in at the grassroots level. And then, yeah, so I hope that in these terms, it will increase representation of people of color in the sport. But I really hope, again, that it's not going to be at their cost in the same way that it might, for example, I mean, I'm not sure if it is how it happens with football, but I can imagine that loads of people who come from underprivileged backgrounds in countries with not such a great financial situation might be thinking, oh, I'm going to become a footballer so I can get out of poverty. Or like the way it's in China, I'm going to become a gymnast so I can get out of poverty. And then a vast majority do not get any benefit out of it because they don't get to have a medal and be a celebrated athlete. So there is always two sides of it. Like on one hand, there will be a greater representation, but on another, will many people be exploited for that? Everything has two sides.
So thank you for the last thought about that. And last topic I want to talk about is the bouldering history. I have to thank you that somehow the way you wrote that chapter about bouldering history made me understand everything a bit better. What I already knew before is that bouldering had for a long time been just a training for alpinists, and it was not seen as a sport on its own. So there were people in Fontainebleau and in the British Lake District doing things that we call bouldering today. And I think one of the earliest historical evidences of bouldering was in the 1880s by Oskar Eckenstein, there in the Lake District. But the man that we call the father of modern bouldering is John Gill from the US. And that is why, because he, in the 60s, he began to see bouldering as a sport on its own. He wrote about bouldering, wrote about like his way of training for bouldering, and like really made it an own part of climbing. And the way you wrote about it, I really like started to understand what his impact was on the sport. And yeah, thank you for that. From what you found out about John Gill, can you give some more context about him, stuff that we should know?
I mean, first of all, it was like such a great privilege for me to be able to talk a little bit with John. We communicated via email. I sent him loads of questions. He was replying, and I found it just so thrilling, you know, to be in conversation with this larger than life figure. He is not only an extremely prolific climber and not only boulderer, we remember him as a boulderer, but he did loads of other types of climbing. But he's a professor of mathematics, like, you know, an actual scientist. So it's just this person that, you know, a very unusual individual that succeeds and excels in very diverse fields in their life. But what I found super interesting about John is how he took his gymnastic training and infused that into climbing. So that's exactly like, you know, this like synthesis of two things that were not thought as akin before gave rise to something that became really, really cool and really appreciated by a lot of people. The idea for John was that you would be able to do super hard moves and the value would be in the movement, not necessarily in getting to the top. So he'd be just like, oh, I want to see if like using momentum in this way and being dynamic and grabbing this hold this way and maybe, you know, just thinking about the movement in this novel way would result in me being able to do this extremely difficult move or extremely interesting move or extremely beautiful move. And that was his new thing, which before would be seen as like, well, why are you doing this? Like, you're just meant to get to the top. The route would be graded for going from the bottom to the top. And just taking this, again, like little part of it would be seen as insignificant. But there is this this quote, which I actually put at the opening part of the chapter, which is, and I think that's from Yvon Chouinard, the founder of Patagonia, who was an extremely prolific climber in his own terms. He said that bouldering is the poetry of mountaineering, which basically means it's like a haiku, you know? It's like it takes like the most beautiful essence and condenses it into this very accessible small form, which again is like so true of so much in climbing. Whether it's a whole route or just one move, it can be extremely interesting. Whether it's a super difficult grade or a grade that's difficult just for a particular person, it's super interesting. Just like I think what John did was he opened up climbing to being more accepting of the fact that you can find a challenge however you want it. And then, of course, he brought chalk into it, which is like an iconic development. Chalk was a gymnastic thing, and he was like, well, maybe we can use it for friction. Now, these days, chalk is a contested thing because, again, it's got a very negative impact on our crags. But nonetheless, it was necessary, and it still very often is necessary for the breakthrough ascents that happened. So, yeah. Oh, and John is an absolute legend in that he like would do like crank pull-ups, you know, well into his 80s and stuff. So.
Okay, so yeah, if you want to know more about John Gill and all the other people and aspects we were talking about, of course, read Zofia's book. And is there anything that you also find really important to know about that I didn't touch now in my questions?
Well, I wanted to say that although I go into a lot of contextualizing within the book, the core part of it is still exciting stories of climbing, because this is traditionally what we do in climbing. We recount those stories of adventure and struggle and success, and it's inspiring. And as you said, storytelling is a very important part of our experience and consuming those stories. So it is there, and I wanted to make sure it was there because I find it fascinating. I just wanted to balance it out with context. I wanted to balance it out with telling the stories of those who were not put in the spotlight before, but they were nonetheless influential, important. And I wanted to show that the experience of the everyday climber is actually what defines the sport. So that's why there is my experience in there, and that's why I tried to give the sort of space and spotlight to everybody's own relationship with the sport. And I think by learning so much about its culture, its context, its multifaceted nature, so much that these days is just forgotten and not spoken about because people think, it's boring. Why would I just want to go climbing. I don't want to know about what people did 200 years ago. These were the same people as we are now. They had the same challenges and passions and breakthroughs, and meeting them in inverted commas is such a great way to develop your own relationship with climbing that will be your own, that will allow you to find your own way as opposed to just copying what others are doing around you, and to find your own real joy in it and, having a positive experience. I think that's the ultimate value in the book, which came to me only after I finished it, because that's what happened to me. While I was writing this book, I didn't become a better climber in the sense that I don't climb harder now. On the contrary, I became a less athletic climber. But I love climbing so much more because I realized that I don't need to climb to prove anything to anybody. I don't need to climb to follow anybody else's path. I just get to do it for my own sake, and it's my thing. And seeing, just go on about that forever. But hopefully people get that same vibe when they read the book.
Yeah. And I thank you very much for writing the book. Thank you for talking, and see you next time.
Thank you very much.
This was my talk with book author Zofia Reych. Their book is called Born to Climb: From Rock Climbing Pioneers to Olympic Athletes. Of course, you find a link in the show notes and also the book list that they have sent me. Enjoy the reading and have a nice Christmas time. This podcast will have a break and come back next year. So, Juliane mein Name und ich bin weg bouldern.